wanted to post something that happened to my mother, Marie, my uncle, her brother David, and my aunt, her sister Gail. A little background first, please. Marie was living in Arkansas, David was living in Florida, and Gail was living in South Carolina. Many miles apart, these three siblings shared the same dream on the same night and called their mother within 24 hours of the dream to tell her of it. This dream occurred in 1989. The dream starts with the three siblings visiting an old farmhouse they lived in as children 30 years ago with their other siblings and parents. The house was empty. Marie, David, and Gail all got out of the car and walked completely around the house, recalling climbing an old oak tree that held a tire swing, recalling the farm area and what used to stand there, etc. When the three returned to the front of the house, there on their steps sat their dear old dad. Dad passed away in April of 1974. Shocked to see their father on the steps, they called out to him. Dad stood at the three with a malevolent grin. He motioned for his kids to follow him into the house. They followed through the living room, past the kitchen, down the hall, until they reached their parents' old room. He turned and looked each one in the eye and put his fingers to his lips as if to say shh. He then motioned with his hands for them to follow. He opened the bedroom door and they followed him inside. He walked to the closet and walked through the closet door. Now in each person's dream, they were the ones about to open the door. As each reached for the doorknob and slowly started turning the knob, their mother appeared from nowhere, screaming at them to not open that door. They instantly woke up from the dream. I was a teenager at the time this occurred, and I did not see the big deal about following their dad into the closet until we visited my grandmother. My grandmother was telling my mother of how David and Gail both called her after Marie did, saying they had the same exact dream as she had. My mother looked scared, and my grandmother told her they all needed to get into church because Satan himself was using their father's image to lure them into something evil. I asked dear old Granny how she got that from a dream and Grandpa going into a closet. She told me because her husband, their father, my granddad, was scared of closets. I thought she meant he was claustrophobic. She assured me he was terrified of closets. The whole time they were man and wife, she would have to get his clothing out of the closets and lay them out for him. She would have to put things into closets. He refused to open them or go into them. My grandmother believes that Satan used Granddad's image to lure the three siblings down a path of evil. I know this isn't much, but I love to hear the story. Within my years, I've had many ghostly experiences, but the most recent experience seemed to scare me the most. Almost every night sitting in the downstairs of my home, I feel a strong presence, each time at a different location within the dining room and the living room. First, you may want to know how my dining room and living room are set in my house. When you first walk into my home, you enter a little narrow hallway, where you then have to go through another door to get into my living room. Then, to get to my dining room, we have a huge opening, and there's my dining room, and my steps to go to the second story in my home. The other night, I was sitting on my couch closest to the two living room windows, but something just kept telling me to look over at the window in the dining room. Sure enough, I saw a black mist that looked as if a face was watching me, but then it disappeared. I passed it off if it were nothing, and that I was seeing things, because it was around 11:30 p.m., and I was quite tired. For some odd reason, My shades were semi-open for 5 blades, and then the rest were closed, so no one can see. I then moved my brother to the other couch, and we sat together, and I just could not keep my eyes off the window in the hallway entrance. Within an hour, I was getting finally comfortable. My brother was sleeping. My mother and stepfather were sleeping, and my older brother was home upstairs, with his car parked outside. I gazed at the window, and the black mist was back, but this time, it was more clear and bigger. It seemed more like a body and a face, but turned to gaze out of my window. Then it sounded like someone was trying to open my front door. It's a big steel door, and when it's locked and somebody tries to open it, it sounds as if someone is pushing against it. It happened at least 6 times before it stopped. I held my little brother close to me. Within the next 15 minutes, it sounded like someone was walking in the hallway and jiggling keys. Well, that was enough for me. I woke my brother up and sent him into my room because I had my air conditioner on in my room. But the jingling sound seemed to follow us to right outside my bedroom door, then stop for the night. My mother recently saw the mist and told it to go back to wherever it came from. It then seemed to glide to my basement door and disappear. My home is about 150 years old, and back then, people couldn't afford to have a proper funeral, so they buried people in the walls in the basement or in the floor. We recently had a dirt basement floor and a cobblestone wall, but we had the floor cemented over. My grandfather, whom I can safely say is a ghost expert, senses something in the walls in my basement. Around my house, but mainly in my room, I know for a fact there is a ghost in my room, but she's a sweet woman, and she just seems to watch me until I fall asleep. There are several ghosts in my home, but recently, I feel as if more are residing here. Just the other night I was drifting to sleep in my room, and I heard the sound as if someone was breathing. I held my breath, and the sound was still there, so I turned the TV on. It seemed to just go away. I was scared, and looked towards the mirror, and saw a flash, and then nothing happened. But I saw the woman, and felt comfort. I feel as if she scared the other spirit away. In my grandmother's house, there is an attic, but it's hidden in the ceiling, and you have to pull the straps down. During the war at her home, soldiers were hid in the attic, and rumor has it, one night, the other people found them and killed everyone in the room. But the one young nurse was beaten and then murdered. I had a dream once about a place where there's a dangling light, and you have to walk on beams and then open a door, and there's a little room with bloodstains. I told my grandmother, and she said I described her attic exactly, even though I'd never been in the attic. The woman who was murdered was a beautiful woman, and she is often spotted around my grandmother's house, scrubbing floors and walking. My grandmother's house was remodeled after the war, and the woman comes down the steps and walks, straight turns, and goes out a door, which is now a window. But before there was a wall separating the rooms and a separate door. Recently, my grandma had seen a little boy petting her dogs, saying, "Come on, doggy, come with me." She thought it was my little brother because he had spent the night, but he was downstairs sleeping, and no one else in the house was awake. She knows he's a ghost, and she is comfortable with him. Although I am severely frightened of her basement, which in 1947, a man was found hanging with a grin on his face, and a woman shot in the head underneath him. There were people found suffocated in their beds, random strangers. My grandma says the boy was one of the children found, and the man is evil. She feels that he may harm me. She doesn't like anyone, except for her in her basement. I have many more stories to tell you, but I'm sorry, I'm out of time. I'll contact you later with many more stories. Thank you. Feel free to email me, or if you just want to exchange experiences, thank you.
Although this is a true tale, it's not one of your spine tinglers, just something odd that cannot be explained. It was told to me several years ago by a colleague and happened to her mum Jean and some friends. Although Jean lived in Romford, Essex, she regularly went to a Keep Fit class in a small school hall in Upminster. The class had finished and her friends had piled into her car and drove around the corner, parking near the chip shop, and they all ordered fish and chips, like you do when you've just had a good workout. They were all sitting in the car quietly eating, when one person noticed something odd and nudged the person next to them. Eventually, they were all mesmerized, mouths agape, chips forgotten as their attention was focused on the activities in the churchyard over the road. Quite clearly, they could see a silent nighttime funeral procession of a coffin being carried on the shoulders by 6 pallbearers, all decked out in long black-tailed coats. They silently watched the procession walk from one side of the church and disappear around the other side. St. Mary's Lane, for anyone who lives nearby. Of course, they all asked the other, "Did you see what I saw?" Knowing full well they did. The next day, Jean decided to visit the church as she just had to know what happened. Maybe someone was buried late last night. However, she got to the church and found the vicar. She worded the question carefully so as not to look like a complete idiot, and was obviously stunned when the vicar told her that no funeral took place last night. She said that from the look on his face it was fairly obvious that he knew why she was asking. But being a vicar, he simply smiled and walked away. Spooky. I've been past the churchyard as my grandparents used to live just down the road, and it is quite a creepy-looking place. All the stones are really old and crumbly and covered in moss. None of the names or dates are readable. It's one of those graveyards where you can look at it for a little while, and then you kind of shudder and have to look away. I used to think it was my childish imagination, but even these days the place still gives me the creeps, even in the middle of summer. My story has to do with things that happened to me as a child. When I was 6 years old, my parents bought a very old house, probably around 100 years old, and that was back in 1976. It was a very large house, and some of the original wallpaper was still in it. I have always been kind of in tune with the supernatural, and I also have a psychic sense. I'm not saying I am psychic, but I just know things and I can't explain it. Well, anyway, I know that my sister was very afraid of this house. She is 3 years younger than me. She would either sleep with my parents or with me, and she would never cross the long hall that ran through the center of the house by herself. I know that one day I was sitting in the living room and I got this really weird feeling, like I wasn't the only one in the room. I felt like someone was staring at me. Now keep in mind that my mother and sister had gone to the store, so I was in the house alone. At this time, I was about 9 years old. I was sitting on the floor and I just happened to look up. If you are familiar with old houses, you know that some have these glass windows at the top of each door that I guess people used for ventilation before air conditioning was invented. Well, the upstairs of this house had been added years after the original one-story had been built, and the steps that led upstairs went even with the glass window above the door in the room I was in. There was also a small triangle of wood that was missing from the step, and that is where my eyes shifted to. There was something looking at me through that space. I was so scared that I grabbed my dog and ran to the front porch, just hoping my mother would drive up. I don't know what it was, but there was something there. People in the neighborhood were always asking if the house was haunted, and one time an old woman I had never seen before asked me if I knew of the girl that had been locked in her room, in my house, and she had died there. There is also another story that happened in this same house. My uncle was living with us. He was 70 years old, and I was about 10 at the time. One night I heard him calling my father. He was shouting, and that is what woke me up. My father went running into his room, and this was my uncle's reply. "I know you're not going to believe this, and I know I shouldn't be seeing this, but I do. There's a black woman standing in front of the fireplace holding a little girl's hand, and she's wearing a red coat and hat." Then my father said that my uncle's eyes followed something around the room, and then my uncle began to scream again, "No, go away! Don't come near me!" Then they disappeared. My father said that he had never been so scared in his life, because his uncle was being rational about it. Like he knew he shouldn't be seeing something like that, but he did. I knew there was something in that house. Although we moved out when I was 14, I still drive by it to look, and I still get a creepy feeling about it, just from driving by. I feel it in my bones. What do you think? I would really appreciate your opinion. Thank you so much.
In the summer of 1999, I bought a house in a small town in Washington state. I'm a California native, so as you can imagine, I had a difficult time adjusting to the calmer settings. It was almost too quiet for my liking. About 3 weeks after I moved into my new home, an old colonial-styled house, I decided and began looking for a roommate. Soon after I placed the ad, I got a phone call from a very willing young lady who said it sounded like the perfect location for her. I took her name down, and she said she would call me the next day to set up a time and place to meet. I waited all day for her phone call, but it never came. I figured she must have found some other place to stay, but I kept the spot vacant in case she called back. A few weeks later, she did call again, and as before, she told me she would call back the next day to set up a time and place to meet. I faithfully awaited her return call, but same as the first time, it never came. I began to get suspicious as to whether it was a prank caller or a real person of interest. I thought it was odd how she'd given me a name without a number. My attempts to find her in the phone book failed, so without any other place to turn, I gave up on the search. About 3 months later, I was up in the attic storing some Christmas decorations I wouldn't be needing for some time when my eyes fell upon an old stack of newspapers in the corner. I was somehow intrigued by a particular paper lying on the top of the stack. As I thumbed through it, I was quite shocked to read an article printed about a young woman who died in her house, the house I was currently living in, at the age of 22. Even more shocking was the name of the woman. It was an identical match to the woman who called about sharing my home. I couldn't catch my breath. I went down to the local historical library and discovered that this woman did indeed live in the very house I now owned in the late 1800s. My visit to the library occurred close to 6 months ago. Since then, late at night, I've heard crying downstairs in my living room. My aunt and uncle used to live in an old log cabin. We think it was by an Indian burial ground, but it was definitely haunted, and the spirit there was not good at all. One night, my aunt and uncle woke up to find they couldn't move. They were being held down by something, but that's not my story. My 3 cousins all shared the same room. It was the only room on the second level. I hated going up there by myself. I never had to before, but this time I did. I was about 6 or 7. My sisters and I had been playing board games with our cousins up in their room. When we went downstairs to watch movies, I left my shoes up there. When the time came to go, I couldn't find my shoes. I looked everywhere. Then my sister reminded me I left them in my cousin's bedroom. I went upstairs and planned to run into the room, get my shoes, then run out and down the stairs as fast as I could. I ran into the room and picked up the shoes, but as I was turning around, I felt something behind me. I was so afraid to turn around, but at the same time, I wanted to run down the stairs, right out of the house and into the car. So I slowly turned around. There I saw a small little Indian girl, maybe about my age. She was surrounded by a blue and white light. I just stood there until she vanished. I ran out to the car where my parents were waiting, and until now I have never told anyone my story except for my aunt, who also sees things. Later I found out that my aunt and uncle would pray to the Indians to watch over them, to protect them from whatever was in that house. Maybe the little Indian girl was just watching over my cousins. My wife and I had moved to the naval station at Mare Island of Vallejo, California. I was attached to the personal support office. About 4 months after reporting, I was sent to the Combat Systems Tech School's command to process new students. I hadn't heard about the school's past until my encounter. One day in the fall of 1993, I was typing up a report about 0730 before the other 3 civilians and 1 other sailor got there. The typewriter was next to the door to my office, so I didn't miss anyone coming or going. There also was just that one main entryway into the office cluster. No other exits except for a fire door with the alarm connected. Anyway, someone walked by my door and I thought it was my shipmate, so I asked how he was doing. I got no reply, so I thought he hadn't heard me and I decided to go bug him after I finished my report. I went to his office and found it locked. Then I noticed the light on down the hall. The light was moving ever so slowly and getting closer to me. It was then that I realized that it was actually a translucent figure of a sailor. It terrified me so much that I ended up passing out from a panic attack. One of the civilian computer programmers walked into the hallway at work, noticed I passed out and shook me awake. I told her I saw something in this hallway and she said that I probably was just overworking myself from stress. I also told her that I thought Brian had walked by. She looked at me and said that nobody had moved from their computers since she got there at about 15 minutes to 0700. She did tell me something fascinating though. She said that at times she could have sworn she heard a whistling and a crying sound coming from the hallway. It sounded a lot like a little girl. It was then that I learned that the school was a fleet hospital for the San Francisco Bay Area built back approximately 100 years ago. The night watch detail would find locked doors open and hear footsteps at night. There were stories told about people hearing sounds of a little ghost girl playing ball near the main staircase. I never had the chance to witness her, and the base is now closed, but it was very interesting. As for the sailor, I have absolutely no clue as to what the story behind this guy was. To spare myself the anxiety, I just revert to thinking it was only my imagination, although it felt as real as anything I could ever see. One other experience was shared by my wife, myself, and my mother-in-law at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii in 1995. My wife had been flown to Tripler Army Hospital due to complications with her first child. My mother-in-law arrived a day before I got there from my ship. Anyway, we were put up in the guest house at Hickam for a couple of nights before being moved temporarily to an officer's quarter in the corner of the base. It was a well-furnished room and had a pleasant air about it. That was until the night arrived. My wife was awoken that first night where she heard multiple whispers. She then went to get herself a cup of milk in the kitchen of the house when she saw the presence of 2 figures crouched down as if they were praying. They both wore brown robes like they were monks. This whole ordeal must have lasted 30 seconds and they faded away quickly. In the morning, we both got up and discussed what we had felt that night. That's when she told me about what she witnessed. The crazy thing was, while she was experiencing that, I told her that I could have sworn I saw the face of an elderly man just staring back at me in the mirror when I used the bathroom. He had scars on his face and was balding. I'll never forget the sight of it. It was an extremely uncomfortable feeling.
Hey Phantoms, first of all, just want to let you guys know that I'm very thankful for your viewership, and I'd like to give a round of applause to everybody who was featured in this video. Hellfreezer and Monsters in My Mind. They did an exceptional job with the stories, and I'd want you to actually go in the comment section below and let them know that you support them, and if you haven't subscribed to them yet, I really suggest that you do. Hellfreezer is a great channel, he creates so much content, and he does daily videos as far as I'm concerned, so go subscribe to him if you haven't already. And he's British, so who doesn't like British people? And also, Monsters in My Mind is so great. He's got I don't know how many subscribers he's at right now. I think it's around 1,000. So if you could actually help him out and subscribe, he's an exceptional talent, probably the most talented person ever alongside Hellfreezer, so please go ahead and actually subscribe to his channel. Tell him that Phantom of Darkness sent you, and don't forget to comment below on this video and let me know which stories you love the most. Obviously, I read the first two stories, so I think those were really good, but Hell Freezers and Monsters in My Mind did an exceptional job with the other stories they told. So really, give this video a share. It really helps the channel grow. And just comment and let me know you're live in the comment section below. Love you guys, and I will see you soon. Love you again.